Welcome back, dear listener, to another journey through history that you probably won't finish, and that's exactly the point. Tonight, we're exploring what it was really like to be a Buddhist monk in ancient Asia. And I do mean really. Not the serene, Instagram-worthy version with perfectly raked sand gardens and wise men stroking their beards while dispensing fortune cookie wisdom. No, we're talking about the actual day-to-day reality of a life dedicated to eliminating suffering, which, ironically, involved quite a lot of suffering. Before we begin, if you enjoy falling asleep to the sound of historical accuracy mixed with mild existential discomfort, please subscribe to the channel. Leave a comment telling us which historical lifestyle you'd absolutely refuse to try. And hit that like button, though I realize the irony of asking you to engage with technology while discussing ancient asceticism isn't lost on me. Now then, get comfortable, adjust your pillow, feel free to close your eyes. Unlike the monks we'll be discussing, you are absolutely allowed to lie down during this. In fact, I encourage it. Let's begin with a simple question. Could you survive as a Buddhist monk in ancient Asia? The answer, statistically speaking, is no. But let's explore exactly why, in enlightening detail. Imagine yourself waking up at 3 a.m. Not because your alarm went off, not because you had too much coffee, but because that's simply when the day begins. And it will begin this way every single day for the rest of your life. The darkness is complete. The air, whether you're in the mountains of Tibet, the forests of Sri Lanka, or the plains of northern India, carries a chill that seems designed specifically to make you question your life choices. Around you, other monks are already stirring. There's a particular sound to a monastery waking up. The rustle of robes, the soft padding of bare feet on cold stone, the gentle but persistent cough of the elderly monk who sleeps 3 mats away from you. No one speaks. Not because speaking is forbidden at this particular moment, though there are plenty of moments when it is. No, no one speaks because what would you even say? Good morning. Morning hasn't technically arrived yet. Sleep well. You've had perhaps 4 hours of sleep on a thin mat over a wooden platform, so that would be sarcastic at best. You rise. Your body protests. Your knees, especially, have opinions about the amount of kneeling and sitting cross-legged you've been doing. These opinions will go unheard. The body, you've been taught, is merely a vessel that apparently didn't get the memo about ergonomics. The first activity of the day is meditation, not a gentle 5-minute mindfulness exercise while sipping herbal tea. No, we're talking about sitting absolutely still in the lotus position for at least an hour, possibly 2, while you attempt to empty your mind of all thoughts. Let me be clear about what this position entails. You sit on the floor. You cross your legs, not just crossing them casually like you might while sitting on a couch. No, you take your right foot and place it on your left thigh. Then you take your left foot and place it on your right thigh. If you're young and flexible, this is merely uncomfortable. If you're not, this is a form of voluntary torture that medieval inquisitors would have respected. Your back must be perfectly straight. Your hands rest in your lap, either in the cosmic mudra or another prescribed position depending on which tradition you're following. Your eyes are either closed or half open, gazing downward at a 45-degree angle at a spot on the floor that you'll come to know more intimately than your own family. And then you sit, and continue sitting. The first few minutes aren't terrible. You're fresh, you're motivated. You remind yourself why you're here: to achieve enlightenment, to escape the cycle of suffering, to attain nirvana. Noble goals, certainly. Then your left foot starts to fall asleep. Not the gentle tingling you might experience after sitting oddly for a few minutes. No, this is a complete loss of sensation, as if your foot has simply decided to abandon the rest of your body. You're not allowed to move. Moving would break your concentration. Moving would be giving in to the desires of the flesh. Moving would be admitting that perhaps you're not as spiritually advanced as you'd like to think, so you don't move. Your foot remains asleep. Gradually, the numbness spreads to your ankle, then your calf. This is fine. This is character building. This is what you signed up for. Around the 15-minute mark, your back begins to ache. Despite your best efforts to sit with perfect posture, tiny muscles you didn't know existed start sending urgent messages to your brain. These messages are quite clear. Please stop doing this. We would like to stop doing this. At your earliest convenience, we really must insist that you stop doing this. You ignore these messages. You are training yourself to rise above physical discomfort. You are learning to separate your consciousness from your body's base demands. You are also, let's be honest, developing chronic back problems that will plague you for decades. But that's the price of enlightenment. Your nose itches. Of course it does. It didn't itch when you were allowed to scratch it. But now that you're committed to sitting perfectly still, your nose has developed the most extraordinary, overwhelming, utterly consuming itch. It's as if every nerve ending in your nose has suddenly woken up and decided to hold a protest. You don't scratch it. You can't. You won't. You redirect your focus to your breathing. In, out. In, out. Your nose still itches. In fact, it itches more. You become convinced that there's a small insect crawling on your nose. There probably isn't, but there might be. You'll never know, because you're not going to break your meditation to check. 30 minutes in, your legs have progressed beyond numbness into actual pain. Not the dull ache of tired muscles, but sharp, specific pain in your knees and ankles. Your joints are expressing their deep dissatisfaction with this arrangement. If your joints could speak, they would be shouting. Loudly, possibly in profanity. You breathe through it. Pain, you've been taught, is just another sensation. Another thing to observe without attachment. Easy to say when you're not the one sitting here with your legs twisted into a configuration they were never evolutionarily designed to achieve. An hour passes, or possibly 3 days. Time has lost all meaning. You're released from meditation, released being perhaps too strong a word, as you can't actually feel your legs to stand up. Around you, other monks rise smoothly, gracefully, as if they hadn't just spent an hour folded like origami. You attempt to unfold your legs. They don't respond. When sensation finally returns, you experience pins and needles so intense you half expect to see actual pins and needles embedded in your flesh. But there's no time to recover fully because now it's time for the morning chanting. You proceed to the main hall. Well, proceed is generous. You hobble, you shuffle, you move in a way that can only be described as ambulatory discomfort. The main hall is large, austere, and, of course, unheated. The temperature inside is precisely the same as the temperature outside, which is to say, far too cold for comfort. The monks gather. You kneel again before the altar. Your knees, still recovering from the meditation session, accept this new indignity with what can only be described as sullen resignation. The chanting begins. Buddhist chanting is a fascinating thing. It's rhythmic, sonorous, and after about 45 minutes, almost hypnotic. Almost. The problem is that you're doing it at 4:30 in the morning, on an empty stomach, after minimal sleep, and your primary experience is not spiritual transcendence, but rather a growing conviction that you might faint. You won't faint, of course. Fainting would draw attention to yourself, which would be prideful. Also, the monk next to you would probably just step over you and continue chanting, which would be embarrassing. The chanting follows a precise pattern. The rhythm never varies. The pitch never changes. You're not singing exactly. You're not speaking exactly. You're doing something in between, a tonal recitation that seems designed to induce a trance state, or possibly just exhaustion. It's hard to tell which comes first. Your voice blends with dozens of others. The sound fills the hall, echoing off stone walls. It's actually quite beautiful, in an austere sort of way. It's also relentless. Sutra after sutra, chant after chant, all in a language that might or might not be your native tongue. If you're a monk in a Tibetan monastery, you're chanting in classical Tibetan. If you're in Sri Lanka, it's Pali. If you're in China, classical Chinese. If you've only recently joined the monastery, you're essentially making sounds that you hope approximate the correct pronunciation. No one correct you. That would require breaking the chanting, and the chanting must continue. An hour passes. The chanting continues. Your throat becomes dry. Your jaw aches. Your knees have apparently decided to register a formal complaint with your nervous system. All of these sensations, you remind yourself, are temporary. All conditioned things are impermanent, including, you hope, this chanting session. Finally, mercifully, the chanting concludes. You rise, carefully, because your knees are no longer reliable, and it's time for the morning meal. You've been awake for approximately 3 hours now, and you're about to consume the first calories you've had since yesterday afternoon. The meal is eaten in silence. Complete silence. Not try to be quiet. Silence. Not whisper if you must. Silence. Absolute unbroken silence. There are hand signals if you need to request something, more rice, more water, permission to be excused, but verbal communication is strictly forbidden. You file into the dining hall in a line, each monk carrying their own bowl. This bowl is precious. It's one of the few possessions you're allowed. You'll use it for every meal. You'll clean it yourself. You'll carry it with you if you ever leave the monastery. For now, you hold it with both hands, following the monk in front of you, trying to maintain the proper pace, not too fast, which would indicate greed or impatience, but not too slow, which would indicate pride or attempt to draw attention. The food is ladled into your bowl by the monks assigned to kitchen duty this week. Next week, it might be you. The rotation of duties is constant. No one is above any task. The abbot himself takes his turn in the kitchen, chopping vegetables and scrubbing pots. What's in your bowl? Rice. Vegetables? Possibly some tofu if you're in a Chinese monastery. Possibly some lentils if you're in a South Asian one. The meal is vegetarian, of course. The first precept, to abstain from killing living beings, is taken seriously. No meat, no fish, no eggs, depending on which tradition you follow. The portions are small. Not, I wish there was more, small. Not, I could eat seconds, small. Small enough that you will finish this meal still feeling hungry. That's intentional. One is meant to eat to sustain the body, not to satisfy it. Eating until full would be indulgent. It would be catering to desire. It would be the opposite of what you're here to learn. You eat slowly, mindfully, using your fingers or chopsticks depending on the regional custom. Each grain of rice is to be noticed. Each bite is to be chewed thoroughly. You're not just eating, you're meditating on eating. You're contemplating the chain of causes that brought this food to your bowl, the rain that watered the plants, the farmers who cultivated, the soil, the sun that provided energy for photosynthesis. You're meant to feel gratitude for all of this. Mostly, you just feel hungry. The meal takes 30 minutes. Then it's over. You wash your bowl in the communal basin, dry it carefully, and put it away. The sun has finally risen. You've been awake for 4 hours. Now, the real work begins. Buddhist monasteries are not places of leisure. They're entirely self-sufficient communities, which means someone has to do all the work required to keep them running. That someone is you, and every other monk. The idea that monks spend their days in serene contemplation, gently tending a small rock garden, is, let's call it, incomplete. You might be assigned to the kitchen, which means hours of repetitive work, chopping vegetables, washing dishes, preparing the single meal that will be served later today. Monks typically eat twice a day, sometimes only once. That might sound simple until you realize you're cooking for 50 or 100 people using medieval technology. No refrigeration, no gas stoves, no running water in many places. Just fire, iron pots, and your own increasingly tired arms. Or you might be assigned to maintenance. Monasteries are large buildings, and large buildings require constant upkeep. Roofs leak. Floors need sweeping. Stone paths need clearing. Gardens need weeding. There's always something that needs repairing, cleaning, or maintaining. You'll do this work in the same silence you've maintained since waking. You'll do it slowly, mindfully, treating each task as a meditation. You'll sweep the same courtyard you swept yesterday. You'll sweep it again tomorrow. This is the nature of maintenance. This is also, allegedly, the nature of enlightenment. Finding peace in repetition, in the acceptance of endless, necessary tasks. If you're lucky, you might be assigned to copy sutras. This sounds peaceful, almost romantic, sitting in a quiet room, carefully transcribing sacred texts. And it is peaceful for the first hour. Then your hand cramps. Then your back aches from hunching over the manuscript. Then you realize you've made an error on the previous page, and you're going to have to start that entire page over, because errors in sacred texts are unacceptable. You copy character after character, line after line, hour after hour. The text is in a language you may or may not fully understand. You're not just copying words. You're copying religious doctrine, philosophical arguments, teachings that others will read and hopefully understand better than you currently do. No pressure. Around midday, there's another meditation session. You sit. Again. In the same position. Again. For another hour or two. Your body, which briefly had time to unfold and stretch while you were working, is now folded back into lotus position. Your knees express their displeasure. You ignore them. This is what you do now. This is your life. The afternoon meal is served in early afternoon, typically before noon, in stricter monasteries, following the Buddha's example of not eating after midday. This meal is slightly larger than breakfast, but only slightly. It will be the last calories you consume until tomorrow morning. You eat mindfully, slowly, gratefully. You're still hungry when it's over. You will remain hungry for the rest of the day. After the meal, there might be a teaching. An elder monk lectures on some aspect of the Dharma, perhaps the Four Noble Truths, perhaps the concept of dependent origination, perhaps the proper way to cultivate compassion. You sit on the floor and listen. You try to stay alert despite having been awake for 12 hours after only 4 hours of sleep. You try to absorb these complex philosophical concepts despite the growing emptiness in your stomach. The teaching might last an hour or 3. Time remains slippery. When it's over, you have a brief period of free time. Free time is perhaps misleading. You're free in the sense that you're not required to be anywhere specific, but you're not free to do whatever you want. You can't go into town. You can't socialize beyond brief, necessary exchanges. You can't read secular literature. You can't listen to music. You can't do most of the things that make free time feel, well, free. You might use this time for personal study. You might walk slowly around the grounds, practicing walking meditation. You might sit in your small room, your cell, really, and contemplate. Mostly, you probably just try to rest because you're tired in a way that goes beyond physical exhaustion. You're tired in your bones. You're tired in your spirit. Evening brings another meditation session. Then evening chanting. Then, finally, mercifully, you're allowed to return to your sleeping quarters. Your bed is a wooden platform with a thin mat. You have one blanket. It's not enough. It's never enough. The monasteries are cold at night. They're built of stone, unheated, often at high altitudes or in forests where temperatures drop significantly after sunset. You lie down. Your body, finally horizontal after 18 hours of sitting, kneeling, and standing, sighs with relief. You're meant to fall asleep contemplating impermanence, or cultivating compassion for all sentient beings. In practice, you fall asleep almost instantly because you're completely exhausted. 4 hours later, you wake up at 3 a.m. The cycle begins again. This is every day, not just weekdays, not just most days. Every single day, the same schedule, the same routine, the same silence, the same hunger, the same discomfort. For years, for decades, for your entire life, if you truly commit. There are no vacations, no days off, no lazy Sunday mornings sleeping in. The closest thing to variety is the change of seasons, which simply means you're cold in different ways. And here's the beautiful irony that makes this perfect content for sleep meditation. You're pursuing the end of suffering by embracing voluntary suffering. You're seeking peace through radical discomfort. You're learning to let go of worldly attachments by attaching yourself completely to a rigid, unforgiving routine. The theory is sound. The Buddha taught that suffering comes from desire, from attachment, from the constant craving for things to be different than they are. If you can eliminate desire, if you can sit with discomfort without craving relief, if you can watch thoughts arise and pass without grasping at them, you can achieve liberation. The practice is challenging. Most people who enter monasteries don't last. They arrive full of spiritual aspiration, ready to transcend the mundane world. Then they discover what transcending the mundane world actually entails. It entails being cold. It entails being hungry. It entails knees that hurt and backs that ache and days that stretch endlessly with no variation, no entertainment, no external validation that what you're doing matters. The ones who stay are either exceptionally dedicated or exceptionally stubborn. Possibly both. They're people who can find meaning in repetition, who can tolerate discomfort, who can sit with themselves, with their thoughts, their doubts, their frustrations, for hours every day without distraction. There are also people who've bought into a complete worldview. You can't survive as a monk if you don't genuinely believe on some level that this is all worthwhile, that enlightenment is real, that suffering can be transcended, that your personal discomfort is a small price to pay for spiritual liberation, or at least for accumulating enough merit to ensure a better rebirth. The daily life we've just walked through isn't even the strictest version. We haven't discussed the meditation retreats where monks sit for 8 or 10 hours a day. We haven't discussed the advanced practices involving extended fasting or sleep deprivation. We haven't discussed the forest monks who live alone in caves, meditating in the wilderness, hoping that isolation and hardship will accelerate their spiritual progress. We also haven't discussed the psychological challenges. You're living in close quarters with dozens or hundreds of other men, but you're forbidden from forming close friendships. You're not supposed to have preferences, not for people, not for food, not for anything. You're trying to transcend your ego, which means noticing every petty thought, every moment of irritation, every flash of pride or jealousy or resentment, and then letting it go. But letting things go is hard when you're tired, hungry, and your knees hurt. So why would anyone do this? What drives someone to voluntarily accept such a life? For some, it's genuine spiritual calling, a deep, unshakable conviction that the material world is ultimately unsatisfying, that worldly success is hollow, that there must be something more. For others, it's desperation, poverty, social ostracism, lack of options. In many parts of ancient Asia, the monastery was one of the few places offering education, security, and social respect, regardless of birth status. For still others, particularly in wealthy families, sending a son to the monastery was a form of religious insurance. Your child gains spiritual merit. You gain spiritual merit by supporting them. Everyone benefits, except possibly your child, who's now sitting in lotus position at 3 a.m., wondering how they got here. And yet, despite everything we've discussed, the discomfort, the hunger, the cold, the silence, the endless repetition, there's something oddly compelling about it all. A life stripped down to absolute essentials. No decisions about what to wear, what to eat, how to spend your day. No social climbing, no keeping up with neighbors, no endless accumulation of possessions. Just you, your practice, and the slow, patient work of trying to understand your own mind. It's terrible in many ways. It's also profoundly simple. And now, as we leave behind this day in the life of a monk, as your own body relaxes into your comfortable bed with its proper mattress and sufficient blankets, as you drift towards sleep without being woken at 3 a.m., perhaps there's a tiny appreciation for the fact that you're not required to achieve enlightenment before breakfast. The monks, meanwhile, continue their routine. Right now, somewhere, monks are waking at 3 a.m. They're sitting in meditation. They're chanting sutras. They're hungry. They're cold. They're tired. They're also theoretically becoming enlightened, or at least trying. Whether that's worth it remains, perhaps, an open question. Now, having thoroughly established that the monastic life is an exercise in systematic discomfort, let's discuss the man who started it all. The person who looked at the full spectrum of human experience, pleasure, pain, luxury, poverty, and decided the answer was to sit under a tree until he figured everything out. Siddhartha Gautama, the Buddha, the awakened one, the man who would become the foundation for a religion practiced by hundreds of millions, despite the fact that he probably would have found the whole concept of organized religion somewhat missing the point. But we're getting ahead of ourselves. Let's start at the beginning, with a birth that, according to later accounts, involved considerably more supernatural phenomena than the average delivery. Siddhartha was born around 563 BCE, give or take a few decades, ancient chronology being somewhat negotiable, in Lumbini, in what is now Nepal. His father was Suddhodana, a ruler of the Shakya clan. The exact nature of his father's position is debated. Some sources call him a king. Others suggest he was more of a local chieftain or elected oligarch. For our purposes, what matters is that Suddhodana was wealthy, powerful, and extremely invested in his son's future. According to traditional accounts, Siddhartha's birth was accompanied by various miraculous signs. His mother, Maya, dreamed of a white elephant entering her womb. Siddhartha emerged from her side rather than through the usual route, took 7 steps, and announced his future enlightenment. Flowers bloomed wherever he stepped. The gods themselves apparently took notice. In reality, he was probably just a baby. A baby born into extraordinary privilege, certainly, but still a baby who cried and needed feeding and did all the regular baby things. The miraculous birth narrative was added later, as tends to happen when a religious movement wants to emphasize the special nature of its founder. Jesus got a star and wise men. Muhammad got angelic visitations. Siddhartha got a white elephant dream and lotus flowers. It's a genre convention at this point. What we do know with more certainty is that his mother died 7 days after his birth. He was raised by his mother's sister, Mahapajapati, who had also married his father. This was not uncommon in the culture. It was, in fact, rather practical. The child gained a mother figure. The father gained support in raising the heir, and Mahapajapati gained status as the mother of the future ruler. A prediction was made, again, according to later sources, by a sage named Asita. He examined the infant and declared that Siddhartha would become either a great king or a great spiritual leader. There was apparently no middle ground in the prophecy. No, he might be a decent regional administrator, or perhaps a competent merchant. Just king or holy man. High stakes from day one. Suddhodana, being a practical ruler, decided he preferred the king option. Spiritual leaders don't generally secure political dynasties or military alliances. Kings do. So he made a decision that would, ironically, guarantee his son would choose the path he was trying to prevent. He decided to shield Siddhartha from anything unpleasant. Completely, totally, absolutely. Imagine growing up in a bubble so complete, so carefully maintained, that you never encounter suffering. Not because suffering doesn't exist, it exists everywhere constantly as it always has, but because an entire apparatus of servants, guards, and administrators is dedicated to ensuring you never see it. This was Siddhartha's childhood and young adulthood. He lived in palaces, multiple palaces according to some accounts. One for summer, one for winter, one for the rainy season. Each palace was luxurious beyond imagination. Gardens filled with exotic plants, artificial lakes with lotus flowers, musicians performing constantly, dancers entertaining, the finest foods prepared by skilled cooks. He was educated in the manner of princes. He learned archery, swordsmanship, horseback riding, wrestling. He studied literature, mathematics, philosophy. He excelled at everything naturally, because according to every hagiography ever written, the founder of your religion was exceptional at all tasks. It's another genre convention. The Buddha was the best at martial arts, also poetry, also contemplation. He won a tournament by shooting an arrow through 7 trees, or something equally improbable. More realistically, he was probably a bright, athletic young man who was good at several things and adequate at others, but whose later fame ensured that every childhood anecdote was retrofitted to demonstrate his inherent extraordinariness. He was surrounded by beautiful people. This wasn't accidental. Suddhodana's policy was clear: only young, healthy, attractive servants. If anyone in the palace became old, sick, or died, they were removed before Siddhartha could notice. The elderly were pensioned off to distant estates. The sick were cared for outside the palace walls. The dead were disposed of with such efficiency that death itself seemed not to exist within Siddhartha's world. It was, in effect, an extremely expensive form of denial, a systematic attempt to convince one person that suffering was optional, rare, or at least something that happened to other people somewhere else. For years, it worked. Siddhartha grew up thinking the world was essentially pleasant, that everyone was young and healthy, that pain was temporary and easily remedied, that life just continued indefinitely in comfort and beauty. At 16, he married. His wife's name was Yasodhara, and she was, according to all accounts, lovely, intelligent, and refined. They had known each other since childhood, being from related noble families. The marriage was almost certainly arranged, as all marriages of that class and era were, but the sources suggest they were genuinely fond of each other, or at least not actively miserable together, which was about as good as arranged marriages got. They had a child together, a son named Rahula. The name means fetter or impediment, which seems rather harsh until you realize it was given after Siddhartha had already begun his spiritual crisis. In hindsight, naming your son obstacle to enlightenment is rather on the nose. But Siddhartha apparently wasn't subtle about his growing sense of being trapped. Because here's the thing about living in a carefully maintained bubble. Eventually, you notice the maintenance. Eventually, you start asking why certain things are prevented, why certain questions are deflected, why the world beyond the palace walls is somehow off limits. Siddhartha began asking to venture outside, to see the city, to understand the kingdom he was supposedly going to rule. Suddhodana, displaying the kind of parental control that modern psychologists would have a field day with, agreed, but only after ensuring that the entire route would be carefully staged. And this is where we get to the famous 4 sights, which are simultaneously the most important and most obviously metaphorical elements of the Buddha's biography. On his first journey outside the palace, Siddhartha saw an old man. According to the traditional account, he had never seen old age before. He turned to his charioteer Channa and asked what was wrong with the man. Channa explained that this was old age. Everyone gets old, if they live long enough. The young become elderly. The strong become weak. The beautiful become weathered. It's universal. It's inevitable. It happens to everyone. Siddhartha was shaken. For someone who had spent 29 years thinking youth was permanent, this was revelatory, and disturbing, and existentially horrifying. On the second journey, he saw a sick person, diseased, suffering in pain. Again, he asked Channa what was happening. Again, the answer was disturbing. Sickness is common. Bodies fail, health is temporary, pain visits everyone eventually. On the third journey, he saw a corpse being carried to cremation. This was apparently the most shocking of all. Channa explained death, the permanent end, the unavoidable conclusion, the thing that happens to everyone, regardless of wealth, status, or how carefully their father tried to shield them from reality. On the fourth journey, he saw a wandering ascetic, a holy man who had renounced worldly life in search of spiritual truth. Unlike the previous three sights, this one offered something, a possible response to suffering, a way of addressing the horror of old age, sickness, and death, not by avoiding them, which was clearly impossible, but by understanding them, by transcending them through spiritual practice. Now, let's pause here and acknowledge the obvious. This story is almost certainly not literally true. Siddhartha did not live for 29 years without ever seeing old age, sickness, or death. That's not how reality works, even with the most devoted servants. Someone in the palace got sick. Someone's grandmother visited and was visibly elderly. Something died. An animal, a servant's relative, a bird in the garden. What the four sights represent is not a documentary account, but a psychological truth. At some point in his late 20s, Siddhartha became aware of suffering in a way he hadn't been before. Perhaps it was gradual. Perhaps there was a specific trigger: his father's aging, his wife's difficult childbirth, a friend's sudden death. Whatever the cause, he experienced what we might now call an existential crisis. He realized that everything he had, his wealth, his family, his palace, his privilege, was temporary. He would age. He would sicken. He would die. So would everyone he loved. The luxury he enjoyed was a distraction at best, a delusion at worst. Pleasure couldn't protect him from the fundamental facts of existence. This is, incidentally, a very common realization for privileged people in their late 20s. The difference is that most people respond by buying a sports car or changing careers. Siddhartha responded by abandoning everything and becoming a wandering, homeless person. The story goes that one night, he looked at his sleeping wife and child. He looked at the palace. He looked at the life that had been planned for him. Decades as a ruler, maintaining the kingdom, raising his son to inherit, growing old, surrounded by wealth and family. And he left. Just walked out. Took his horse, rode to the edge of the forest, cut off his hair, exchanged his princely clothes for rough robes, and sent his horse back with his charioteer. His family woke up to find him gone. No note, no explanation, no goodbye. Just an empty room and a future that had suddenly evaporated. From a modern perspective, this is somewhat appalling behavior. He abandoned a wife who presumably hadn't signed up for widowhood by husband still alive. He abandoned a young son who would grow up without a father. He abandoned responsibilities and duties because he was having a philosophical crisis. From the traditional Buddhist perspective, this was necessary. Enlightenment required complete renunciation. Family attachments were, by definition, attachments. To achieve liberation, he had to let go of everything, including the people depending on him. The moral ambiguity here is worth sitting with. Siddhartha was simultaneously pursuing the highest possible goal, understanding the nature of reality and escaping suffering, and behaving in a way that caused immediate suffering to people he supposedly loved. This tension never quite resolves in Buddhist tradition. It's acknowledged, but not really addressed. The assumption is that his eventual enlightenment justified the abandonment, and that his teachings would ultimately benefit far more people than were hurt by his departure. Whether his wife agreed with this assessment is not recorded. So began Siddhartha's 6 years as a wandering ascetic. He sought out the most renowned meditation teachers of his time. First, he studied under Alara Kalama, who taught advanced meditation techniques leading to formless states of consciousness. Siddhartha mastered these quickly. Then he studied under Uddaka Ramaputta, learning even more refined meditation states. Again, he mastered them rapidly. But neither teacher offered what he was looking for. They taught how to achieve temporary states of peace, how to quiet the mind for hours or days. They didn't teach how to permanently escape suffering. They didn't offer liberation, just temporary relief. So Siddhartha left them and joined a group of 5 ascetics practicing extreme austerities. This is where the story becomes almost darkly comedic in its extremity. If you thought the monastic life we described earlier was harsh, you haven't seen anything yet. These ascetics believed that enlightenment came through punishing the body. The more you suffered physically, the more spiritually pure you became. The theory was that physical pain burned away karmic impurities, that by torturing the flesh, you freed the spirit. Siddhartha embraced this with the same intensity he'd brought to everything else in his life. He practiced extreme fasting, consuming as little as 1 grain of rice per day, sometimes less, sometimes nothing. His body wasted away. His ribs became visible. His skin darkened and dried. His hair fell out. He became skeletal, barely alive, sustained only by sheer willpower and presumably a significant amount of delusion. He held his breath for extended periods, depriving his brain of oxygen until he passed out. He slept on beds of thorns. He stood in one position for days at a time. He exposed himself to extreme temperatures, meditation in the hot sun, sitting naked in winter, anything that would cause maximum physical discomfort. His 5 companions were impressed. Here was someone who truly understood asceticism, who wasn't half-hearted about spiritual practice, who was willing to go further than anyone in his commitment to liberation through suffering. For 6 years, Siddhartha did this. 6 years of systematic self-torture in the name of enlightenment. And at the end of those 6 years, he had a realization. It wasn't working. He was suffering, certainly. He was experiencing tremendous physical pain, definitely. But he wasn't any closer to understanding the nature of reality. He wasn't transcending suffering. He was just adding to it. He was replacing the suffering of existence with the suffering of starvation and self-mutilation. But suffering was still suffering. The ascetic path was, he realized, just as much a trap as the life of luxury he'd abandoned. Both were extremes. Both were forms of attachment. One to pleasure, one to pain. Neither led to actual liberation. This is known in Buddhist tradition as the middle way, though middle is somewhat misleading. It's not a compromise between extremes. It's a rejection of the entire framework that makes extremes seem like the only options. It's recognizing that the solution to suffering isn't found in either indulgence or self-punishment, but in understanding why we suffer in the first place. Siddhartha decided to start eating again. Not luxuriously, but adequately. Enough to restore his health, enough to give his mind clarity rather than the fog of starvation. His 5 ascetic companions were disgusted. He had given up. He had become weak. He had returned to the path of pleasure. They left him, convinced he had failed. Siddhartha, now alone, walked to a grove near the town of Bodh Gaya in what is now the Indian state of Bihar. He found a large fig tree, later known as the Bodhi tree, the tree of awakening. He sat down beneath it. And he made a vow. He would not rise until he had achieved enlightenment. He would sit there and meditate until either he understood the truth of existence or he died trying. This was not a vow to sit for a weekend retreat. This was an open-ended commitment. Hours, days, weeks, however long it took. This was a man who had spent 6 years torturing himself and had finally accepted that the only way forward was through sheer, stubborn, patient determination to simply sit and observe. What happened next is described differently depending on which Buddhist tradition is telling the story. Some versions involve demonic temptations, Mara, the personification of death and desire, sending beautiful women to seduce him, sending armies to frighten him, sending doubts to undermine him. Other versions are more psychological, describing internal battles with his own doubts, fears, and attachments. Stripped of metaphor, what likely happened is that Siddhartha sat in meditation for an extended period, possibly days, possibly weeks, and systematically examined his own mind. Not trying to achieve any particular state, not trying to feel peaceful or holy or transcendent, just observing, watching thoughts arise and pass, watching sensations come and go, watching the entire process of consciousness with complete, sustained attention. At some point, tradition places it on the full moon night of the 4th month, after 49 days of meditation. Something shifted. Siddhartha saw clearly how suffering arises, not abstractly, but directly in his own experience. He saw how craving leads to attachment, how attachment leads to suffering, how all conditioned things are impermanent, how clinging to them is like grasping at water, how the self that seems so solid is actually a process, constantly changing, without any permanent essence. He understood dependent origination, the chain of causation that leads to suffering. He understood the 4 noble truths. Suffering exists. Suffering has a cause. Suffering can end, and there is a path to ending it. He understood, in other words, everything he had left home to understand. He became the Buddha, the awakened one, not because he was now supernatural or omniscient, but because he had seen reality clearly, without the distortions of craving, aversion, or delusion. He sat under that tree for 7 more days, simply being present with this understanding. Then he stood up. His first thought, according to tradition, was that no one would understand what he had realized. It was too subtle, too contrary to normal ways of thinking. Teaching it would be exhausting and probably futile. Then he reconsidered. Perhaps some people would understand. Perhaps somewhere there were people whose minds were ready to hear this. People who had also recognized the fundamental unsatisfactoriness of ordinary existence and were genuinely seeking a solution. So he decided to teach. He walked to Sarnath, near Varanasi, where his 5 former ascetic companions were staying. They saw him approaching and agreed among themselves not to show him respect. After all, he had given up the true path. But when he arrived, something about him had changed. His presence, his manner, the way he carried himself. They couldn't maintain their dismissive attitude. They welcomed him. They asked what had happened. And the Buddha delivered his first teaching, the 4 noble truths and the Eightfold Path, the middle way between indulgence and asceticism, the practical method for ending suffering. His 5 companions became his first disciples, his first Sangha, the community of practitioners who would carry on his teachings. For the next 45 years, the Buddha wandered through northeastern India, teaching anyone who would listen. He taught merchants and kings, beggars and priests, men and women, high caste and low caste. His teaching was radically egalitarian for its time. He insisted that spiritual liberation was available to anyone, regardless of birth, that the caste system was ultimately meaningless, that what mattered was practice, not privilege. This didn't make him universally popular. The established Brahmin priesthood, whose entire social position rested on the premise that spiritual authority was hereditary, found his teachings threatening. Local rulers sometimes supported him, sometimes opposed him, depending on their political calculations. Other wandering teachers debated him, sometimes converting to his path, sometimes remaining opponents. He established a monastic order, the Sangha we discussed earlier, with all its rules and discomforts. He laid out detailed guidelines for monastic conduct, for meditation practice, for ethical behavior. He told stories, used metaphors, adjusted his teaching style depending on his audience. To the intellectually sophisticated, he offered subtle philosophical analysis. To the simple, he offered clear moral guidelines. He also, despite his earlier abandonment, allowed his family back into his life. His son, Rahula, became a monk. His foster mother, Mahapajapati, petitioned him repeatedly to allow women to become monastics. He eventually agreed, establishing the order of nuns, though the rules for nuns were always more restrictive than those for monks, reflecting the gender biases of the culture he lived in. His wife, Yasodhara, also became a nun. Whether there was ever a conversation between them about his abandonment, whether she forgave him, whether they ever discussed the son he left behind, none of this is recorded. Buddhist tradition treats the family reunion as wholesome and complete, but one suspects there were some awkward silences. The Buddha's life as a teacher was, by most accounts, remarkably successful. He attracted thousands of followers. His teachings spread across northeastern India. He debated rival teachers and generally came out ahead, at least in accounts written by his followers. He performed what were described as miracles, though whether these were actual supernatural events or metaphorical victories or simply the exaggerations that accumulate around important figures is anyone's guess. He also, despite his enlightenment, had to deal with remarkably mundane problems. His cousin, Devadatta, tried to take over the Sangha, creating a schism. Some monks broke rules and had to be disciplined. Donors squabbled over who had given more to the community. Other religious teachers spread rumors about him. Kings asked for political advice he preferred not to give. Enlightenment, it turns out, doesn't exempt you from administrative headaches. He grew old. The vibrant young prince, the skeletal ascetic, the newly enlightened Buddha, all gradually became an elderly teacher, still walking from place to place, despite increasing physical frailty. His back ached. His joints hurt. He got sick. He experienced all the indignities of aging that he had first encountered on that fateful journey outside the palace. At age 80, he ate a meal that disagreed with him. The sources suggest it was either spoiled pork or poisonous mushrooms, though some traditions insist it was something vegetarian, perhaps a mistranslated word, perhaps a later editorial decision that the Buddha couldn't have eaten meat. Regardless, he became violently ill. He knew he was dying. He had his attendant Ananda prepare a resting place between two sal trees near Kushinagar. He lay down on his side, in what's now called the lion's posture, the same position he'd held during countless hours of meditation. His disciples gathered around him. His final words, according to tradition, were, "All conditioned things are impermanent. Work out your own salvation with diligence," which is a rather unsentimental way to go when you think about it. No grand pronouncements, no dramatic revelations, just a reminder that everything changes, including him, and that his followers needed to do their own work rather than relying on him. Then he died. His body was cremated according to the custom. His relics were divided among various kingdoms and enshrined in stupas. His teachings were memorized by his disciples and passed down orally for several centuries before being written down. And thus ended the life of Siddhartha Gautama, a man who responded to the fact of suffering by sitting very still until he understood it, then spending the rest of his life teaching others to sit very still until they understood it too. The irony, of course, is that his response to suffering created a system that involves quite a lot of suffering, the voluntary suffering of monastic discipline, the difficulty of meditation, the discomfort of giving up everything you find pleasant. He replaced involuntary suffering with voluntary suffering in service of understanding suffering. Whether this is wisdom or just a different form of the same problem depends, perhaps, on whether the understanding actually comes. Whether sitting in lotus position at 3 a.m. actually leads to enlightenment, or just to very sore knees. The Buddha would probably say that the question itself is missing the point, that asking whether it works is still thinking in terms of goals and outcomes, still trapped in the framework of craving for results. But he'd probably say it kindly, with infinite patience. After all, he spent 45 years dealing with people who asked similar questions. He had practice. And now, as we transition away from biography toward mystery, as we leave behind the man and move toward the traditions that emerged from his teaching, perhaps take a moment to appreciate that you're lying comfortably in bed, not sitting under a tree, making vows about enlightenment, that you ate dinner and will eat breakfast tomorrow, that your family knows where you are. Small comforts, perhaps, but Siddhartha Gautama would probably agree they're not nothing. Now that we've established both the discomfort of monastic life and the life of the man who invented it, let's discuss something appropriately mysterious for a sleep meditation. The texts that didn't make it. The teachings that vanished. The sutras that existed, were copied, were studied, were revered, and then disappeared, leaving behind only fragments, references, and the nagging question of what we're missing. This is perfect content for drifting off to sleep, by the way. Nothing says restful contemplation quite like knowing that vast amounts of potentially crucial religious and philosophical wisdom have been lost to time, and will probably never recover them. It's like counting sheep, except the sheep are ancient manuscripts and they're on fire. Let's begin with the fundamental problem. The Buddha didn't write anything down. Not one word. Not a single sutra. Not even a quick note to himself about the key points of dependent origination. He spent 45 years teaching, giving what must have been thousands of discourses, and never once thought, you know what? I should probably write this down in case people forget. To be fair to him, writing in 5th century BCE India was not the common, everyday activity it would later become. It existed, but it was primarily for administrative purposes, contracts, tax records, royal decrees. Religious teaching was transmitted orally, memorized, passed down from teacher to student. This was the tradition. This was how knowledge was preserved. Except, of course, oral transmission has a rather significant flaw. People forget things. They misremember. They add helpful clarifications that then become part of the canon. They lose entire sections. They die unexpectedly before passing everything on. After the Buddha's death, his disciples gathered for the first Buddhist council to recite and agree upon his teachings. This happened, according to tradition, just 3 months after his passing, at Rajagaha. 500 senior monks attended. Ananda, the Buddha's longtime attendant, recited the discourses. He had, apparently, an extraordinary memory. Upali recited the monastic rules. Everything was organized, categorized, committed to collective memory. Or at least, that's the story. Whether this council actually happened in precisely this way is debatable. What we do know is that the teachings began to be organized into collections. The suttas, or sutras, discourses, the Vinaya, monastic rules, and later the Abhidhamma, systematic philosophy. These were still not written down. They were chanted, memorized, repeated. Generation after generation of monks memorizing vast quantities of text, passing them down to their students, who passed them to their students, who passed them to their students. For about 400 years, this continued. 4 centuries of oral transmission. 4 centuries during which the only way to preserve the Buddha's teachings was for human beings to remember them perfectly and recite them accurately. If this seems like a remarkably fragile method of preservation, that's because it is. Finally, in the 1st century BCE in Sri Lanka, during the reign of King Vatagamani, someone had a sensible idea. Maybe we should write these down. A major drought was causing widespread death among the monks, and there was a genuine fear that if too many memorizers died, the teachings would be lost entirely. So they wrote them down. In Pali, the liturgical language that had been used for recitation, on palm leaves, with iron styluses, creating what would become the Pali Canon, the Tipitaka, the 3 baskets of Buddhist scripture. This was happening in Sri Lanka. Meanwhile, in India, in Central Asia, in China, other Buddhist communities were doing the same thing, writing down their versions of the teachings in Sanskrit, in Chinese, in various other languages. These versions sometimes agreed with each other. Sometimes they didn't. Sometimes they contained entirely different sutras that the other traditions had never heard of. Which raises an interesting question. Which version is correct? Which represents what the Buddha actually taught? The answer, unsatisfyingly, is that we don't really know. We have multiple versions of many sutras, and they often agree on the broad outline, but differ in details. We have sutras that exist in only one tradition, and were apparently unknown to others. We have references to texts that no longer exist in any form. The Mahayana tradition, which emerged several centuries after the Buddha's death, produced an entirely new category of sutras, texts that claimed to be the Buddha's teachings, but were clearly composed long after his lifetime. These weren't forgeries in the malicious sense. They were understood as spiritual revelations, teachings that the Buddha had given but that humanity hadn't been ready to hear until later, or teachings that the Buddha gave in other realms to bodhisattvas and celestial beings, which were only now being revealed to humans. Theravada tradition rejected these texts as inauthentic. Mahayana tradition insisted they represented a higher teaching. Both sides were absolutely certain they were right. The result is that Buddhist scripture is not a single, defined collection like the Bible or the Quran. It's a sprawling, contradictory, multilingual library, where different traditions accept different texts as authoritative, and where the canon continued to expand for centuries after the Buddha's death. Now, having established the chaotic nature of Buddhist textual transmission, let's discuss what's been lost. In the 7th century CE, a Chinese monk named Xuanzang traveled to India. His journey would later inspire the novel Journey to the West, though that version includes considerably more demons and a talking monkey than the actual trip involved. Xuanzang was on a mission to collect Buddhist texts and bring them back to China. He spent 16 years traveling through Central Asia and India, visiting monasteries, studying with teachers, and most importantly, collecting manuscripts. He returned to China with 657 texts, 657 different Buddhist works, many of which were completely unknown in China. He spent the rest of his life translating them. He managed to translate about 75 of them before his death. The rest? Many were never translated. Some were lost. Some probably still exist in storage somewhere in China, untranslated, unread, waiting for someone to get around to them. This was not unique to Xuanzang. Throughout Buddhist history, monks traveled long distances to collect texts. They brought them back to their home countries. They translated some. They stored the rest. They died. Their successors might or might not continue the translation work. Meanwhile, the original manuscripts deteriorated, were damaged by water or fire or insects, or were simply lost in the chaos of political upheavals. The great Buddhist universities of ancient India, Nalanda, Vikramashila, Odantapuri, had vast libraries, thousands of texts, commentaries on commentaries, philosophical treatises, meditation manuals, ritual instructions. These universities were centers of learning for centuries, attracting scholars from across Asia. Then, in the 12th and 13th centuries, Muslim armies invaded northern India. They destroyed the universities. They burned the libraries. According to some accounts, the library at Nalanda burned for 3 months. That's how many texts there were. Most of those texts no longer exist anywhere. Some survived because copies had been made in Tibet or China or Southeast Asia. Many didn't. Entire philosophical schools, complete bodies of commentary, meditation systems that had been developed over centuries. Gone, burned, lost. What's particularly maddening is that we know some of these texts existed because they're referenced in other works. An 8th century commentary will cite a 5th century text extensively. The commentary survives. The original text doesn't. We have quotes, summaries, critiques of texts we can no longer read. It's like having a detailed book review of a novel that no longer exists. You know it was important. You know people thought deeply about it. You'll never know what it actually said. The Abhidharma tradition, the systematic philosophical analysis of Buddhist doctrine, produced hundreds of texts in multiple schools. Each school had its own Abhidharma literature, its own way of categorizing reality, its own technical vocabulary. Most schools no longer exist. Most of their texts are lost. We have the Abhidharma of the Theravada tradition and some of the Sarvastivada tradition. The rest vanished. The Sautrantika school, which was apparently very influential in its time, produced extensive literature. We know this because other schools argued with them constantly. These arguments are preserved. The Sautrantika texts being argued against, mostly lost. We can reconstruct some of their positions from the critiques, but it's like trying to understand one side of a phone conversation. You get the general idea, but you're missing crucial context. There were apparently numerous collections of Jataka tales, stories of the Buddha's previous lives. These were used for teaching, for entertainment, for moral instruction. Some collections survive. We have 547 Jataka tales in the Pali tradition, but references suggest there were other collections, other stories, other traditions of these tales. Most are lost. The same is true for the Avadana literature, the stories of past saints and practitioners. We have some collections. Chinese translations preserve others. but many are mentioned in bibliographies or catalogs that list texts once available in monastery libraries, texts that no longer exist. Meditation manuals are particularly frustrating losses. The Buddha taught meditation. His disciples taught meditation. Over the centuries, various meditation masters developed specific techniques, wrote detailed instructions, created systematic training programs. Some of this literature survives, texts like the Visuddhimagga, or various Chinese and Tibetan meditation manuals, but others are lost. We know, for instance, that there were detailed instructions for specific types of samadhi, for kasina meditation practices, for various visualization techniques. We have brief mentions, references, fragments, not the full instructions. If you wanted to practice these techniques now, you'd be working from incomplete information, trying to reconstruct meditation methods from abbreviated descriptions. The Mahayana tradition produced its own mysteries. The Prajnaparamita literature, the perfection of wisdom texts, grew over centuries. It started with relatively short texts and expanded into massive works. The largest version, in 100,000 verses, no longer exists in complete form. We have parts, we have summaries, we have translations into Chinese and Tibetan that may or may not be complete, but the full Sanskrit original, gone. The Heart Sutra and the Diamond Sutra, two of the most famous Buddhist texts, are actually tiny excerpts from this larger Prajnaparamita literature. They're like, if you took War and Peace and published just 2 key conversations as standalone books, and then the original novel was lost. You'd have those conversations, which are meaningful on their own, but you'd be missing the context, the build-up, the complete argument. Tantric Buddhism produced extensive literature, rituals, initiations, visualizations, complex philosophical systems. Much of this was intentionally kept secret, transmitted only orally from teacher to student. Some was written down but kept in restricted access. Some was written in intentionally obscure language, twilight language, that required a teacher to decode. The result is that even when tantric texts survive, they're often incomprehensible, without oral instruction that may or may not still exist. You can read the words. You cannot necessarily understand what they mean. It's encryption without a key. And then there's the problem of language death. Buddhist texts were written in many languages: Pali, Sanskrit, various Prakrit dialects, Gandhari, Tocharian, Sogdian, Khotanese, and dozens of others. Some of these languages are no longer spoken. We can sometimes read them if we have enough comparative material. Sometimes we can't. There are Buddhist manuscripts in languages we cannot fully translate because the language died and we don't have enough examples to fully reconstruct its grammar and vocabulary. Imagine finding a Buddhist text in an unknown language. You can see it's Buddhist. There are familiar names, familiar concepts, but you can't read most of it. It sits in a museum or library waiting for a breakthrough in linguistic research that may never come. The knowledge is there, physically present, and yet completely inaccessible. The Silk Road monasteries and caves, places like Dunhuang in China, preserved vast numbers of manuscripts for centuries. The dry climate prevented decay. Texts that would have rotted in more humid regions survived. In 1900, a Taoist monk named Wang Yuanlu discovered a sealed cave chamber at Dunhuang containing approximately 50,000 manuscripts and printed documents. This was an incredible find. Texts thought lost suddenly became available. But there's a dark comedy to what happened next. Various foreign explorers, Aurel Stein, Paul Pelliot, others, purchased or acquired large numbers of these manuscripts and took them back to Europe. Wang Yuanlu, who was apparently not a great businessman, sold priceless texts for pittances. The manuscripts are now scattered across multiple countries in different collections. Some have been catalogued and studied. Many haven't. They sit in storage in London, Paris, St. Petersburg, Berlin. Some have been digitized. Most haven't. There are probably texts in these collections that no scholar has properly examined since they were acquired over a century ago. What's in them? We don't fully know. The catalogued items include Buddhist sutras, commentaries, meditation instructions, monastic records, personal correspondence, government documents, and various other materials. The uncatalogued items could include anything. There could be, sitting in a box in a museum basement somewhere, a text that would revolutionize our understanding of early Buddhism, or a complete meditation manual for a practice that's been lost, or a sutra that was thought to exist only in fragments, or something entirely unexpected. Or it could just be another copy of a text we already have multiple copies of. That's the frustrating thing about manuscript discoveries. You don't know what you have until you examine it carefully, and careful examination takes time, expertise, and funding. Tibetan Buddhism preserved an enormous amount of material that was lost in India. When Buddhism was destroyed in India, Tibetan monasteries held what was often the only surviving copy of important texts. The Tibetan canon, the Kangyur and Tengyur, contains hundreds of texts translated from Sanskrit, many of which no longer exist in their original language. But even in Tibet, texts were lost. The Cultural Revolution in the 1960s and 70s destroyed thousands of monasteries. Libraries were burned. Monks were forced to destroy their own texts. Some texts survived because a few copies were hidden or smuggled out. Others didn't. And even before the Cultural Revolution, there were fires, floods, wars, and simple neglect. Texts printed on woodblocks deteriorated. Manuscripts on paper were eaten by insects. Knowledge was lost through the accumulation of small disasters. There's a particular poignancy to the texts we know existed because someone catalogued them. Ancient library catalogs survive that list texts once available. You can read the titles. You can see how many volumes each text comprised. You can note which texts were frequently consulted and which were rarely checked out. And then, you can confirm that most of them no longer exist. You have a library catalog for a library that burned down centuries ago. You know what was lost. You can quantify your ignorance with precision. The Yogacara school, one of the major Mahayana philosophical traditions, produced extensive literature. Some survives. Texts like the Yogacara Bhumi or works by Vasubandhu and Asanga are still available, but other Yogacara texts are lost. We have references to them, quotations from them in surviving works, but not the full texts. The same is true for the Madhyamaka school. Nagarjuna's major works survive, but other Madhyamaka philosophers, their works exist partially or only in translation, or only as citations in other texts. Chinese Buddhist catalogs list texts that were translated from Sanskrit but no longer exist in any language. The Sanskrit originals are lost. The Chinese translations are lost. All that remains is a title in a catalog and maybe a brief description. This happens more often than you'd think. A text is translated. The translation is not widely copied. The few copies that exist are gradually lost to time. Both the original and the translation disappear, leaving only a record that they once existed. There are also texts that may never have been written down at all, oral teachings passed from teacher to student, meditation instructions given individually, philosophical insights shared in conversation. Some of this was eventually codified. Much probably wasn't. The Buddha's teachings on meditation, for instance, were almost certainly more extensive than what's preserved in the sutras. He taught for 45 years, to thousands of students, individualized instruction for different temperaments and abilities. The sutras preserve some of this, but imagine how much was taught in one-on-one settings, or in small groups, that was never recorded because it was considered either too basic or too advanced, too common or too specialized. Forest meditation traditions preserved teachings orally within small lineages. Some of these lineages died out. The teachings died with them. No one wrote them down because they were meant to be transmitted personally, experientially. Written words were considered inadequate. This makes a certain philosophical sense. How do you write down a meditation instruction that depends on knowing the student's current state of mind, their obstacles, their misconceptions? You can write general guidelines, but the specific, tailored instruction dies with the teacher unless the student becomes a teacher and passes it on. And sometimes they don't. Sometimes a lineage has one excellent teacher and no qualified students. The teaching dies. Or sometimes there are qualified students, but they die young, or they're killed in war, or they get sick. The continuity breaks. Tantric lineages are particularly vulnerable to this. If a lineage requires unbroken teacher-to-student transmission, and that transmission is broken, teacher dies before fully training a student, for instance, the lineage ends. The practices may be written down somewhere, but without the oral instructions explaining what the written text actually means, they become incomprehensible. There are entire tantric cycles, collections of practices centered on particular deities or meditation techniques that are considered broken lineage. The texts exist. No one can practice them properly because the oral explanations are lost. This creates a strange situation where you have what looks like complete information, but is actually useless. It's like having a recipe where all the measurements are deliberately written in code, and the code key was transmitted orally, and everyone who knew the code is dead. You have a recipe. You cannot make the dish. The problem of translation adds another layer of loss. When texts were translated from one language to another, meaning was inevitably altered, not through malice, but through the simple fact that languages don't map onto each other perfectly. Some concepts don't translate. Some nuances get lost. Some ambiguities get resolved in ways that foreclose other interpretations. Sanskrit Buddhist texts were translated into Tibetan. The translators were careful, skilled, dedicated. They created standardized terminology. They worked with Indian pandits to ensure accuracy. And still, something was lost. The Tibetan translations are excellent, but they're not identical to the Sanskrit originals. They're interpretations, even when they're trying to be literal. Chinese translations are even more interpretative. Classical Chinese and Sanskrit are structurally very different languages. Early Chinese translators sometimes significantly altered texts to make them comprehensible to Chinese readers. They added explanations, changed metaphors, reorganized arguments. The same text in Sanskrit and Chinese can be noticeably different. This means that when we only have a Chinese translation of a lost Sanskrit text, we're getting an approximation, a version filtered through linguistic and cultural translation. It's valuable. It's all we have. but it's not the original, and sometimes we have multiple translations of the same text that differ significantly from each other. The same Sanskrit text translated by different people into Chinese will produce different results. Which translation is more accurate? Often, we can't tell because the Sanskrit original is lost. Scholars try to back-translate, to reconstruct possible Sanskrit originals from Chinese or Tibetan translations. This works sometimes. Sometimes it produces something that might be close to the original. Sometimes it produces Sanskrit that's technically grammatical, but stylistically unlike any actual Buddhist text. It's an imperfect solution to an insoluble problem. There's also the issue of texts that were intentionally suppressed. Not all Buddhist texts were considered orthodox by all Buddhist communities. Some were controversial. Some were condemned as heretical. Some were banned. When a text is officially banned, copies get destroyed. People stop making new copies. The text gradually disappears. Usually, all we have left is the ban itself, a decree or commentary explaining why this particular text is dangerous and wrong. The text being condemned, gone. We can sometimes reconstruct these texts' arguments from the refutations, but it's like reading one side of a debate. You can infer what the other side said, but you don't have their actual words. The early Buddhist councils, there were several after the first council, were often about defining orthodoxy, about deciding which teachings were authentic and which weren't. The losing side in these debates, their texts were often marginalized, then lost. The Mahasanghika school, for instance, was one of the earliest Buddhist schools. They had their own canon, their own Vinaya, their own philosophical positions. Most of it is lost. We have fragments, references, and a lot of guesswork about what they actually taught. Why? Because other schools became more dominant, because royal patronage shifted, because monasteries that preserved Mahasanghika texts were destroyed or converted to other schools, because history is written by winners, and texts are preserved by whoever's still around. There's a bitter irony to this. The Buddha emphasized that people should test his teachings themselves, not accept them on authority. But over time, Buddhist institutions developed strong notions of orthodoxy. Texts that didn't fit were lost. Teachings that challenged prevailing interpretations disappeared. The result is that the Buddhism we have access to is the Buddhism that survived, which is not necessarily the same as the Buddhism that existed. We're seeing through a filter of historical accidents, political decisions, and institutional preferences. What we're missing might be crucial, or it might be redundant. We'll never know. The lost texts haunt Buddhist scholarship. Every scholarly work on Buddhism includes footnotes referencing texts that no longer exist, citations of citations, reconstructions based on fragments. It's like trying to complete a jigsaw puzzle when most of the pieces are missing and you're not entirely sure what the picture is supposed to be. New discoveries occasionally surface. A manuscript turns up in a private collection. A previously uncatalogued text is identified. A basement storage room is finally examined properly. Each discovery is exciting. Each discovery also reminds us of how much remains undiscovered or is lost forever. The texts we do have are treasures. The Pali Canon, the Chinese Tripitaka, the Tibetan Canon, the surviving Sanskrit manuscripts, the fragments from Gandhara, the Dunhuang manuscripts. They represent centuries of preservation, copying, translation, and care. But they're fragments of a once much larger whole. The Buddhist literary tradition was vast, sprawling, diverse. What survives is what someone thought important enough to copy, or what happened to be in the right place at the right time, or what got lucky. The rest is silence. Or rather, the rest is educated guesswork, scholarly reconstruction, and the nagging awareness that our understanding of Buddhist history and philosophy is incomplete. Not slightly incomplete, dramatically incomplete. We're missing large sections of the conversation. And there's something oddly appropriate about this. Buddhism teaches impermanence. All conditioned things pass away, including, apparently, large portions of the Buddhist textual tradition itself. The texts were impermanent. The teachings they contained were about impermanence. There's a symmetry to it, even if it's frustrating. Perhaps the Buddha, if he could see how much of his teaching tradition was lost, would just shrug. All compounded things are impermanent, he said. He probably meant it to apply to his own teachings, too. Or perhaps he'd be annoyed that people didn't write things down sooner. It's hard to say. He's not around to ask. And so, as we drift away from the mysteries of lost texts, as you lie comfortable in your bed surrounded by the astonishing amount of preserved knowledge available at the tap of a screen, perhaps there's a small comfort in the fact that at least you're not responsible for memorizing vast quantities of religious text to ensure their survival. The monks in ancient monasteries, sitting in cold meditation halls, repetitively chanting sutras they'd memorized, preserving knowledge through sheer force of repetition. They're not you. You're not them. You get to simply sleep, knowing that whatever knowledge was lost, it's not your fault. It's not your responsibility to recover. Some mysteries remain mysteries. Some texts remain lost. And that's fine. That's impermanent. That's the nature of conditioned things. And now we arrive at the final segment, where we examine the gap between theory and practice so vast you could fit several enormous, wealthy monasteries in it, which is convenient, because that's exactly what we're discussing. The phenomenon of Buddhist institutions dedicated to renunciation accumulating massive wealth, temporal power, and political influence. The irony is so thick you could meditate on it, which, presumably, some monks did, in their lavishly appointed quarters in monasteries that owned thousands of acres of productive land. Let's begin with the Buddha's actual teachings on material possessions, just so we're clear on the baseline from which we'll be dramatically departing. The Buddha advocated renunciation, complete, thorough renunciation. A monk was supposed to own precisely 8 items: 3 robes, a begging bowl, a razor, a needle, a belt, and a water filter. That's it. That's the complete list. Everything else was technically prohibited. The robes were supposed to be made from discarded cloth, literally, rags collected from garbage heaps, cremation grounds, or roadsides. They were to be washed, dyed a specific color. The exact color varied by region, but generally something between orange and brown, and sewn together. Not tailored, not fitted, just functional rectangles of cloth draped over the body. The begging bowl was for collecting food. You were not supposed to store food. You were not supposed to have a kitchen. You went into town in the morning, stood silently with your bowl, accepted whatever people chose to give you, and ate it before noon. Whatever remained was discarded. Tomorrow, you'd beg again. This was intentional poverty, radical simplicity. The monk was supposed to be completely dependent on the lay community for survival, which kept him humble and connected to ordinary people. He had no wealth to manage, no possessions to maintain, no property to defend. This system lasted for approximately, well, it's hard to say exactly, because historical records are imprecise, but the answer is not very long at all. The problem arose almost immediately. People wanted to support the Sangha. Wealthy donors wanted to give generously. Kings wanted to sponsor entire monasteries. Land was donated. Buildings were erected. Endowments were established. The Buddha had tried to prevent this. He created rules limiting what monasteries could accept. He emphasized that monks should live simply. He told stories warning against the corrupting influence of wealth. And then he died, and the Sangha discovered that having a permanent building was actually quite nice compared to sleeping under trees during the rainy season. Within a few centuries, Buddhist monasteries across Asia had become substantial landowners, not by buying land. That would have required money, which they technically weren't supposed to have, but through donations. Pious laypeople, hoping to gain merit, gave land to monasteries. Kings, seeking Buddhist legitimacy for their rule, granted vast estates to monastic institutions. The monasteries didn't refuse these gifts. Refusing would have been insulting to the donors. Refusing would have suggested that the donors' merit-making activities were unwelcome. Refusing would have required explaining that, well, actually, accumulating wealth violated the founders' explicit teachings, which was an awkward conversation to have with the person offering to make you rich. So they accepted. And they developed very creative interpretations of what acceptance meant. Technically, the monastic rule said monks couldn't own property. But the Sangha, the community as a whole, that was different. The Sangha could own property. Individual monks still owned only their 8 permitted items. They just happened to live in elaborate monasteries, built on land owned by the institution, surrounded by wealth that technically belonged to everyone collectively, and therefore to no one individually. It's the kind of hair-splitting that lawyers would admire. By the time we reach the medieval period, roughly 7th to 13th centuries CE, though the timeline varies by region, Buddhist monasteries in China, Tibet, Korea, Japan, and Southeast Asia had become economic powerhouses. They owned farms worked by tenant farmers or slaves. They ran businesses. They loaned money at interest. They had warehouses full of grain and treasure houses full of gold. In China, the great monasteries became centers of commerce. They operated mills. They ran hostels for travelers. They organized markets. Monks who had supposedly renounced the world were managing complex business operations and engaging in what we'd now call investment strategies. The Japanese monasteries, particularly the Tendai and Shingon institutions on Mount Hiei and Mount Koya, acquired so much land and power that they maintained private armies. Actual armies. Warrior monks called Sohei who wore robes, carried weapons, and engaged in military campaigns to defend monastic interests or resolve disputes over property rights. Let me pause here to emphasize. We're talking about Buddhist monks, followers of a teacher who preached non-violence and renunciation, leading armed soldiers into battle over property disputes. The cognitive dissonance is extraordinary. The historical reality is well documented. In Tibet, the great monasteries like Sera, Drepung, and Ganden became essentially feudal estates. They owned villages. The peasants working monastery land were serfs, bound to the land, required to provide labor and goods to the monastery. The monasteries collected taxes. They adjudicated legal disputes. They exercised governmental functions over their territories. The highest-ranking monks, the abbots, the tulkus, the rinpoches, lived in considerable comfort. They had servants. They had private quarters. They had fine robes made from new cloth, not discarded rags. They ate well. They exercised administrative and political power. Meanwhile, the lower-ranking monks, the ones who weren't reincarnations of previous masters, who didn't come from aristocratic families, who had no political connections, lived in basic conditions, did menial labor, and approximated something closer to the Buddha's intended lifestyle. But they were doing so within an institution that was wealthy, powerful, and thoroughly integrated into the feudal social structure. The Tibetan system also developed the institution of child monks. Families would dedicate sons to the monastery, sometimes as young as 7 or 8 years old. This served multiple functions. It reduced the number of mouths to feed at home. It gained the family religious merit, and in some cases, if the child was identified as a reincarnation of an important lama, it elevated the entire family's social status. These children were educated, trained in ritual and philosophy, and absorbed into monastic life. Some thrived. Some were presumably miserable, but had no alternative. Leaving the monastery after being dedicated as a child was socially difficult and sometimes practically impossible. You'd been raised with no other skills. Your family might not take you back. Society viewed ex-monks with suspicion, so you stayed. You continued in a life you might not have chosen, in an institution that had diverged dramatically from its founder's vision, performing rituals for donors who believed their financial contributions were accumulating spiritual merit. The economics of merit-making deserves its own discussion. The entire system of monastic wealth rested on a theological premise. Giving to the Sangha generated religious merit. The more you gave, the more merit you accumulated. This merit would improve your karmic status, leading to a better rebirth or even progress toward enlightenment. This created a market for merit. Wealthy lay people wanted to accumulate merit. Monasteries provided the opportunity to do so by accepting donations. The more prestigious the monastery, the more merit your donation supposedly generated. Therefore, wealthy donors competed to give to the most important monasteries, which made those monasteries wealthier, which made them more prestigious, which attracted more donations. It's a positive feedback loop that the Buddha definitely didn't anticipate when he established the rule that monks should depend on daily alms. The monasteries, for their part, developed elaborate rituals and services to provide donors with tangible evidence of merit accumulation. You could sponsor a sutra recitation. You could pay for a ritual performance. You could fund the copying of sacred texts. You could commission statues or paintings. Each activity had an associated cost and an associated merit value. It's worth noting that nowhere in the Buddha's recorded teachings did he establish an exchange rate for merit. There's no sutra where he says, sponsoring the chanting of the heart. Sutra is worth X amount of merit, while funding a 3-day ritual generates Y amount. The whole concept of quantifiable, purchasable merit emerged later, as monasteries became economic institutions and needed to formalize the transaction. Some monasteries became pilgrimage destinations. They housed important relics, a tooth of the Buddha, a hair, a piece of bone. Pilgrims traveled long distances to pay respects to these relics, and while they were there, they made donations. The monastery housing a particularly important relic could become fantastically wealthy from pilgrimage traffic. The relic trade itself became, let's call it, questionable. After the Buddha's cremation, his relics were divided among 8 stupas. Within a few centuries, there were hundreds of stupas claiming to house authentic Buddha relics. Either the Buddha had far more teeth than a normal human, or someone was being creative about authentication. The same problem applied to relics of other important Buddhist saints and teachers. Everyone wanted relics. Relics attracted pilgrims. pilgrims brought donations. Therefore, relics proliferated in ways that seemed biologically unlikely. But questioning the authenticity of a monastery's prized relic was both impolite and potentially dangerous. The monastery had a vested interest in maintaining the relic's authenticity. Questioning it threatened the institution's prestige and income. Better to simply accept that yes, this is definitely a genuine tooth of the Buddha, and make your donation accordingly. The Chinese monasteries developed particularly sophisticated economic systems. They operated pawn shops, providing loans to laypeople. The interest rates were sometimes substantial. This created an interesting situation where impoverished peasants might be paying interest to wealthy monasteries, with both parties understanding this transaction as somehow spiritually beneficial. The monasteries also operated what we'd now call banks. They provided secure storage for wealth. They facilitated transactions. They issued what amounted to letters of credit. A merchant could deposit money at one monastery and withdraw it at another, connected monastery in a distant city, paying a fee for the service. These were sophisticated financial services, provided by institutions whose members had theoretically renounced material concerns. The contradiction was occasionally noted. Reform movements periodically emerged, usually led by monks who felt the Sangha had strayed too far from the Buddha's teachings. These reformers advocated returning to simplicity, renouncing wealth, and living in forests on minimal alms. Sometimes these reform movements gained traction. Sometimes new, strict monasteries were founded. Sometimes there were widespread efforts to purify the Sangha and restore authentic practice. And then, inevitably, these reformed monasteries became successful. Their reputation for purity and strict practice attracted donations. Within a generation or two, they too became wealthy. The cycle repeated. The forest monk tradition tried to resist this pattern by literally staying in forests, away from cities and donors. But even forest monasteries needed some level of support. And when a forest monastery gained a reputation for housing particularly holy monks, donors sought them out. Paths were built through the forest. Support structures emerged. The forest monastery gradually became less isolated, less austere, and more institutionalized. A few monks managed to maintain genuine poverty and simplicity, but they did so by being deliberately obscure, by moving frequently, by avoiding reputation and recognition. The moment a monk became known for holiness, donors appeared, and donors brought wealth, and wealth brought complexity. There's something almost tragic about this pattern. The most sincere practitioners had to hide their attainments to maintain their practice. Because Buddhism, as it developed, was structured in a way that made fame and simplicity mutually exclusive. The political entanglement of wealthy monasteries created additional problems. In China, monasteries became so powerful that emperors periodically felt threatened by them. Several times in Chinese history, emperors ordered massive purges of Buddhism, destroying monasteries, forcing monks and nuns to return to lay life, confiscating monastic land and wealth. The most famous of these purges happened in 845 CE under Emperor Wuzong of Tang. He ordered the destruction of over 4,600 monasteries and 40,000 temples and shrines. Over 260,000 monks and nuns were forcibly secularized. Monastic land was confiscated. Metal Buddhist statues were melted down for coinage. The official reason was Taoist influence and concerns about economic drain, but the underlying issue was power. The monasteries had become too wealthy, too influential, too independent of imperial control. They needed to be brought to heel. Buddhism in China recovered from this persecution but it never regained its pre-845 dominance. The great monasteries rebuilt, but they remained more cautious about accumulating obvious wealth and political power, at least for a while, until enough time passed and the cycle began again. In Japan, the situation became even more directly violent. The warrior monk armies fought each other. The Tendai monks on Mount Hiei fought the true Pure Land monks. They fought the government. They fought anyone who threatened their interests. In 1571, Oda Nobunaga, a warlord unifying Japan, decided the warrior monks of Mount Hiei were too problematic to tolerate. He surrounded the mountain and burned it down. The entire monastery complex, along with thousands of monks, nuns, and civilians seeking sanctuary, were destroyed. It was a massacre, and it was done to an institution that was, theoretically, dedicated to nonviolence and compassion. The monastery was eventually rebuilt. The institution continued. But the incident demonstrates how far Buddhist monasteries had diverged from their foundational principles. They had become military and political powers, and they suffered military and political consequences. Southeast Asian monasteries developed somewhat differently. In Thailand, Burma, and Sri Lanka, monasteries remained more closely integrated with local communities and royal patronage, without developing independent military power. But they still accumulated wealth and political influence. In Thailand, the Sangha became essentially a department of the state. The king was the official protector of Buddhism. He appointed the supreme patriarch. The monastic hierarchy mirrored the political hierarchy. Senior monks had ranks and titles comparable to government officials. This created stability. There were no warrior monk armies in Thailand, but it also meant the Sangha lost independence. Monasteries served state interests. Monks who criticized the government could be defrocked. The institution became conservative, defending the status quo because the status quo protected the institution. The Burmese monasteries accumulated vast land holdings and became major economic players. At various points, monastic land comprised a significant percentage of the country's cultivated area. The monasteries paid no taxes. The monks performed no physical labor. The entire economic burden fell on the lay population, who supported the monasteries through both religious devotion and, frankly, social obligation. If you didn't support the monastery, you were a bad Buddhist. Your neighbors would judge you. Your family would judge you. Social pressure ensured ongoing financial support for institutions that might or might not be fulfilling their spiritual function, but were definitely consuming substantial resources. Sri Lankan monasteries became centers of Sinhalese national identity. Being Buddhist became synonymous with being Sinhalese. The monasteries preserved culture, language, and history. They also became thoroughly enmeshed in ethnic and political conflicts, sometimes encouraging violence against Tamil minorities in the name of protecting Buddhism. Again, we're talking about institutions founded on principles of nonviolence and compassion, actively participating in ethnic conflict. The contradiction is jarring. The historical reality is undeniable. The pattern across Asia is consistent. Buddhist monasteries became wealthy, powerful institutions that bore little resemblance to the Buddha's vision of wandering mendicants dependent on daily alms. The justifications varied by culture and time period, but the outcome was the same. Some historians argue this was inevitable. Institutions need resources to survive. Buildings need maintenance. Libraries need funding. Education requires support. Complex philosophical traditions can't be maintained by monks living under trees eating one meal a day. Therefore, institutional wealth was necessary for Buddhism to flourish as an intellectual and cultural tradition. This argument has merit. The great Buddhist universities, Nalanda, Vikramashaila, produced sophisticated philosophy, preserved vast libraries, and educated scholars from across Asia. They couldn't have done this without substantial funding. The artistic traditions, Buddhist painting, sculpture, architecture, required patronage and resources. The transmission of Buddhist teaching to new cultures required stable institutions with the capacity to train translators and support missionaries. So perhaps the wealth was justified. Perhaps it was a necessary compromise between the ideal of renunciation and the practical requirements of maintaining a complex religious tradition across centuries and continents. Or perhaps it was a fundamental betrayal of the Buddha's teaching, a case of institutions prioritizing their own survival and comfort over the principles they claimed to represent. Both things can be true simultaneously. This is the nature of institutional religion generally. The gap between founding principles and institutional practice is not unique to Buddhism. It's arguably universal. Christianity preached poverty and ended up with the wealth of the Vatican. Islam emphasized equality and developed elaborate hierarchies. Every religious tradition faces this tension. What's particularly interesting about Buddhism is that the founder explicitly addressed this issue. He knew that wealth and power were corrupting. He created rules specifically designed to prevent monastic accumulation, and the rules were circumvented, reinterpreted, or simply ignored when they became inconvenient. The monasteries would argue they were following the spirit, if not the letter of the law. That collective ownership was different from individual ownership. That using wealth to support Buddhist practice was legitimate even if accumulating wealth was not. That the merit system justified the entire economic arrangement. The Buddha might have disagreed, but he wasn't around to lodge a complaint, and the institutional momentum was powerful. Once a monastery owned land, employed farmers, ran businesses, and exercised political influence. Dismantling all that in favor of returning to simple wandering mendicancy was unlikely. Institutions are remarkably good at self-perpetuation. Some individual monks throughout history managed to live simply, to reject wealth and comfort, to practice genuine renunciation. Their stories are preserved as examples of authentic practice, which implicitly acknowledges that most monks weren't managing this. There's a Thai forest monk tradition that emphasizes strict adherence to the Vinaya rules. These monks live in forests, meditate extensively, eat one meal a day before noon, own only the permitted items. They're held up as exemplars of authentic Buddhist practice. The fact that they need to be specifically identified as such suggests that most monks are not living this way. In contemporary times, Buddhist monasteries range from traditional institutions, maintaining old patterns, to reformist organizations trying to address historical problems. Some monasteries have become essentially tourist attractions, their religious function secondary to their role in cultural heritage. Some have become meditation centers catering to Western practitioners seeking spiritual experiences. Some continue as traditional religious institutions serving local communities. The wealth question persists. Some Buddhist organizations are quite wealthy, owning property, running schools and hospitals, managing substantial investment portfolios. The justification is that this wealth serves the Dharma, supports Buddhist practice, and benefits sentient beings. Cynics might note that it also supports comfortable lifestyles for senior monks, funds organizational expansion, and maintains institutional prestige. Both things can be true. The pattern we've traced, from wandering mendicants to wealthy institutions, is not simply a story of corruption or hypocrisy. It's more complex than that. It's about how ideals confront reality, how spiritual principles interact with practical necessities, how institutions balance founding principles against survival needs. The Buddha taught renunciation. He also created an institution. Institutions require resources. Resources create complexity. Complexity creates distance from simplicity. And, before you know it, you're a wealthy monastery with land holdings, political influence, and a very creative interpretation of what renunciation actually means. Is this a failure? Perhaps. Is it inevitable? Possibly. Is it ironic? Absolutely. And as you drift toward sleep in your comfortable bed, in your climate-controlled room, surrounded by your possessions and free from the obligation to renounce anything at all, perhaps there's a certain relief in knowing you're not responsible for resolving this tension. The monasteries continue, some wealthy, some poor, most somewhere in between. They preserve teachings, serve communities, and wrestle with the same contradictions they've been wrestling with for centuries. The gap between ideal and practice remains. The irony persists. And that's fine. That's human. That's what institutions do when they encounter the messy reality of existing over time, in a world that requires resources, makes demands, and doesn't particularly care about your founder's teachings regarding simple living. The Buddha sought to end suffering. He created a path. The path became a tradition. The tradition became institutions. The institutions became wealthy. The wealth created new forms of suffering, inequality, corruption, violence, and the spiritual discomfort of knowing you're part of a system that contradicts its own founding principles. Whether this represents enlightenment or its opposite is left as an exercise for the practitioner to determine, preferably while sitting in meditation, in a monastery that may or may not own extensive property holdings.